We believe in the power of the law to advance democracy, equity, and justice. It takes a collective effort to transform lives and protect the well-being of our communities. Let's renew our commitment to our shared ideals. Let's stand at the forefront of the issues of the day. Hello, I'm Mary Smith, President of the American Bar Association, with another episode of the ABA Presidential Speaker Series. Under the theme, Lifting Our Voices, Charting the Future, these fireside chats spotlight trailblazers shaping our collective future, inspiring thought, and fostering understanding of pressing global issues. I'm excited to present today's special Black History Month program featuring two special advisors to the ABA Task Force for American Democracy, former Merck CEO Kenneth Frazier and former American Express CEO Kenneth Chenault. Today's program will be moderated by Paulette Brown, past ABA president. Paulette?
Thank you, Mary, for that introduction, and thank you for coming up with this concept of this wonderful Black History Month program. And now I'd like to give you a little brief introduction to our wonderful speakers today. First, I'll start with Ken Chenault. Ken Chenault is the chairman and managing director of the venture capital firm General Catalyst. Prior to joining General Catalyst, Ken was chairman and chief executive officer of American Express, a position he held from 2001 until 2018. Upon Ken's retirement from American Express, Warren Buffett, the company's largest shareholder, stated, "Ken's been the gold standard for corporate leadership and the benchmark that I measure others against." And I'd like to turn now to Ken Frazier, who is the chairman of General Catalyst Health Assurance Initiatives and is the former chairman and CEO of Merck Pharmaceutical. Under Ken's leadership, Merck delivered innovative, life-saving medicines and vaccines, as well as long-term and sustaining value to its multiple stakeholders. Ken substantially increased Merck's investment in research, including early research, while focusing the organization on the launch and growth of key products that provide far-reaching benefits to society. Thank you both for joining us today. As I mentioned, we're celebrating Black History Month. And Black history is something that should be a part of everyone. And we're going to start with a question that I think, and what I admire so much about the two of you, is your social activism and your commitment to economic inclusion. And so my first question is related to that. And what I want to know is, as individuals so prominent in the global business community, what has led you to be involved in social activism? And was there a particular triggering event that caused you to be engaged in such a prominent way? And Ken Frazier, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Paulette. And I want to thank Mary Smith for making this opportunity available. I want to thank the audience for being here. So with respect to your question, I can't think of a triggering event. I have to say, going back to my childhood, the dinner table conversations were at that time about, for example, the civil rights movement. My mother and father talked about it. They exposed us to it. It was a very important issue. When I graduated law school, I practiced law for 15 years and spent a significant amount of my time working on these kinds of issues. We called it pro bono in those days, whether it was representing people under sentence of death, teaching in South Africa, bringing voting rights litigation in my hometown of Philadelphia. That's what lawyers did. And then when I came to Merck and had the opportunity to become a business person with Ken Chenault's mentoring, I might add, I took that set of values with me. So there wasn't a particular triggering event. What you call social activism, it felt to me was my responsibility, given where I was placed, either as a lawyer or as a business person.
And when you read Ken Frazier's extensive bio, he touched on South Africa, he touched on representing death row inmates. I would encourage you to read more about that. Ken C., Was there a triggering event for you?
So I think similar to Ken, I think both of us grew up, I think, as we affectionately call ourselves, brown babies, meaning we were born shortly before or shortly after Brown v. Board of Education. And I think what was important is we grew up in the civil rights era. And if you think about the next frontier of civil rights at that time, it was business. Now, while I didn't have a single triggering event, there were two individuals who actually talked to me about business because I grew up wanting to be a civil rights lawyer. I did not know about business. I did not have any role models in business. But I was fortunate in my first year of law school to meet Reginald Lewis, who was the person who did a very large leverage buyout of Beatrice Foods. And Reggie came to speak to the Black Law Students Association at Harvard. And what he said was, there's a whole frontier of business, and you should think about it. And very frankly, I didn't think about it a lot, but I think he planted a seed. And the other individual was Derek Bell, who said, not all of you will become Thurgood Marshall, but you should bring a civil rights mindset into whatever you do. And I would say that clearly had an impact on me. And I think similarly to Ken, I think having strong values growing up in the civil rights era means that we do have a mindset that we want our country to really realize, everyone to realize the American dream.
That's wonderful. And can I be just really selfish right now and tell you that Reggie Lewis grew up on Mosier Street, 2 blocks from my street, West Landell Street. So I've got a real affinity towards him as well. Not in the kind of way that you did, but it was wonderful to listen to how he influenced you, and as well as Professor Bell. So I'm going to move on to the next question and ask you more about the social and economic inclusions that are sort of entwined in the things that you do, and ask about, you've done so much, but what else can the corporate community do to make sure that these two things are always interconnected and entwined?
Let me start by saying, we just finished talking about the kind of social activism and political activism that led to the civil rights movement. There's still a lot of work to be done in that vein, but I think most of the work that needs to be done now has to do with economic development. If you look at African Americans across the country, some people would say, look at how many large cities have Black mayors. Some people, we have Black governor, we have a Black vice president, we had a Black president. So there's been progress. There's no question that there's been progress. Where there's still challenges is the fact that many African Americans still are locked out of the economic mainstream. And so for us, for Ken and myself, and we'll talk about this later, we feel like it's really important to find avenues to get people into that economic mainstream. For example, the Black middle class has grown tremendously in the last 30 years, but there's still significant poverty in the Black community. And for children growing up, for example, in Philadelphia, where I'm from, where your parents are able to obtain real estate really dictates your future. It really does. At the end of the day, if your parents can afford real estate proximate to where the good public schools are, then you have a much better chance in life. The life expectancy in my old neighborhood of North Philly is 20 years less than it is in the adjoining neighborhood of Society Hill. And that has to do with the economics of growing up in a poor area. And so for me, I think the big challenge now is getting people into the economic mainstream.
I think economic opportunity is so important. And the Black community we have not had the pathways presented to us for economic opportunity. Forget about the paucity of CEOs at Fortune 500 companies. The reality is, if you look at the pathways to economic success in this country, we've been denied a number of those opportunities to go down those pathways. And so what's critical is, for every single job category, we need to figure out ways to ensure that Blacks get on those pathways. And the reality is, while we have seen progress, I mean, it's hard to imagine 75 years ago, Ken and I would not have been CEOs. But the reality is, the income inequality gap in this country has widened. For Blacks, it has widened. And we need to understand that we have to, in fact, focus on the development and implementation of concrete programs that will drive outcomes that will really make a difference.
Okay, so I want to go right to the heart of what you're talking about and talk about your personal responsibility and how you've taken on this personal responsibility. And in that regard, I want you to talk about 110.
In case people don't know what 110 is, 110 is a coalition of 60 plus large companies around the country that have pledged to support a change in how they recruit, how they hire, how they promote. Significantly, the change has to do with looking at their job criteria and deciding which jobs actually require a four-year degree. Something like 75% of African Americans at age 26 lack a four-year degree. And so these companies are looking carefully at what we call skills first approach and saying, which jobs really do require a four-year degree? And by eliminating that four-year degree requirement where it isn't actually work related, we're actually opening the pathway, as Ken just said, for many African Americans. I would point out that when you move to a skills first approach, it has a disproportionately positive effect on African Americans, but it helps everyone who doesn't have a four-year degree. In fact, about half the country lacks a four-year degree. So for us, in the wake of the George Floyd tragic murder, we were hearing a lot of conversations in corporate America about how corporate America could respond to the racial equity gap. And there were lots of ideas being put on the table, contributions, statements, et cetera. Ken and I were in a lot of those discussions, and we said, what's really in the wheelhouse of corporate America is to hire people. And we want to be able to put ourselves in a situation where the structural barriers that exist in terms of educational opportunity don't necessarily translate into economic barriers because people don't present themselves in the first instance at an entry level with a four-year degree.
One of the things that's really important of this organization is the long-term commitment we have. That's why we've said a 10-year target was important, of 1 million jobs in 10 years, putting people in family-sustaining jobs. And this is going to be a very important effort. What we hope is that our demonstration of success will spawn a range of programs, because this really personifies what we're talking about, is providing economic opportunity. And this is an example, I just underline one of Ken's points. While Blacks will be disproportionately affected in a positive way, the reality is all segments of society will be impacted. So this is not a win-lose proposition. This is a win-win, because there are groups of people representing every racial group, religious group, ethnic group, that in fact have been denied an opportunity to move forward. So I think what I would really emphasize about 110 is it benefits everyone. It has a positive disproportionate impact on African Americans. That's terrific that we have a win-win.
Have you established any benchmarks for 110, and how is it looking so far? I know that it's a relatively new program. It's a relatively new, wonderful initiative, but what kind of progress have you seen so far?
The way I would describe this is in the world that Ken and I live in, venture capital, 110 is in the startup phase. We are encouraged with the progress. We have very clear metrics that we follow on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis. And we're encouraged with the progress that we're making. But the reality is we still have a long way to go. We're very, very focused on that, but we are confident that we will achieve our objectives.
And right now, I can tell you the data would say that we have hired over 110,000 African-American people into these family-sustaining wage jobs, $50,000 or more. And I saw a review recently saying that over the last 2 years, that population has made over $12 billion in income. So it has had already a very significant impact. I'm suspecting that you're going to talk about DEI next and the challenges that are associated with DEI. And I will say that when we began 110, the atmosphere was very different as it related to the racial gap. And it's one that we're going to have to deal with in a very different way post the Supreme Court case. But I'll let you ask your question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. And it's like you're reading my mind. So that makes me a little bit afraid. But I do see that we have a question from the audience, and it's coming from Dominic Calhoun, who is the president of the National Bar Association. Dominique?
Recently, the Wall Street Journal issued a study which examined the American workforce by gender and race. According to its research, 86.1% of all lawyers in America are white, and 1 of every 7 lawyers in the country is African American. Since the recent decision in the Students for Fair Admissions by the Supreme Court, we have seen privately held entities sued for their diversity efforts. Fortune 500 companies regress in its efforts to ensure a diverse workforce, and challenges to many state and local bar associations have been brought regarding their diversity pipeline efforts. Given the current state of affairs regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have 2 questions. First, what strategies would you implement as a chief executive to change the narrative around DEI? And second, what solutions would you provide to the ABA and other bar associations regarding the protection of diversity pipeline programs to ensure a diverse legal profession?
I would start by saying that it's really important for people to understand that we're having this debate in our country about what DEI actually is and what it isn't. Like many other questions in our society, often we find that they are discussed at the extremes. So one extreme, the extreme bringing the lawsuits, would say that these DEI programs are essentially racism, that they're reverse discrimination against whites and other groups, and therefore they should be unlawful. There are people on the other side, like we are on the 110 side, who say this is really about providing opportunity. And when I say providing opportunity, expanding the pool of qualified people by looking in places that you traditionally don't look to find talent, making sure that the systems by which we measure and develop our talent are fair and are not hidden, don't have hidden, discrimination as part of them, and ensuring that we pick the right people for the right roles in our companies. So the challenge is you have a lot of people who are saying all of a sudden that anything that has to do with sort of racial equity is itself racism. I think, for example, if you look at the decision from Chief Justice Roberts, he's essentially saying that in today's America, the only way to get rid of discrimination is to not consider race. Well, if you go back to an abstract level, one can understand how one could argue that in a multiracial society, the best way of governing that society is to pay no attention to race. The difficulty is that for many people, race is a form of inherited structural disadvantage. And so how do we look for ways of providing opportunity to those people who have that structural disadvantage or that systemic disadvantage, if you will, in a way that doesn't prevent us from rewarding success or achievement from others. Like many things, we can do both of those things if we're thoughtful. And so to answer your question, I think the solutions are really to have lawyers look at these programs carefully, not to overreact to the fact that there are lawsuits, because if we become too defensive, we're in essence outsourcing our human resources strategy, our human capital strategy to the people who are bringing these lawsuits. I think even with the Supreme Court's decision, there's a lot of room for companies to think about expanding the pool of qualified people, ensuring that people have a fair and equal opportunity to make progress in the company. You know, the reality of the world can refer to it. Less than 2% of Fortune 500 CEOs are African Americans. I think it's 1.5% right now. I think there's a lot of room to improve this in ways that are consistent with the Supreme Court's opinion, which I will point out, even in that opinion, Chief Justice Roberts reminds us that while we can't use race as a surrogate for everything else, that is, it can't trump qualifications on an individual basis, what an individual has experienced is still relevant, including the impact that race may have had on that individual. So it's really important for us to recognize that there's still opportunities, that there's still maneuverability, but we've got to be nuanced and understand what the legal restrictions are. I still think with those restrictions, and I'm hoping that the law firms that are listening also contribute to this, help clients understand how they can achieve their goals without being liable in these kinds of lawsuits.
From a CEO's perspective, what I would ask both my in-house counsel and my external counsel is do not be overly cautious, meaning simply saying this is a controversial issue and we should not do anything. We should, in fact, pull back. That to me would be irresponsible. That's irresponsible advice. I think the job of legal counsel, as they would on any business issue or challenging business issue, is to figure out a way to accomplish objectives in the legal framework that you're presented with. And I think that's very important. Second thing I would say on diversity, there is the reverse racism point that Ken made. There is also a point that people are saying you cannot maintain excellence and have diversity. That is a false argument. The reality is, if we look at this country over the last 100 years, are people really saying they want to go back to where we were 100 years ago, when Blacks were denied opportunity, women were denied opportunity, ethnic groups were denied opportunity? So this view, when people say, I want to get back to excellence, my question is, what do you mean by excellence? Because the reality is, I think our institutions, in fact, have been able to pursue excellence as they have pursued diversity. For those of you who have followed these issues, I would recommend that you read a recent letter from the president of Princeton, who in a very eloquent way talks about excellence and diversity. And he says, we can do both. We've demonstrated we can do both. So I think what's important, as Ken said, people like to argue on the extremes, and they like to use inflammatory anecdotes. But we need to be very clear that for this country to achieve the ideals of America, we have to be focused on opening up opportunities to everyone. And I get concerned when I hear some people in the business world say, I don't know if I want to use the word diversity. The reality is that if we start backing away, the negative consequences on this country will be substantial. So I think this is a time where we need lawyers, we need people in business to, in fact, not lose the passion for diversity. Because at the end of the day, America at its best is when it has pursued, throughout its history, when it has pursued real diversity.
What Ken just said really is so marvelous. It really does capture the real heart of what we should be focusing on. But to come back to this false dichotomy between merit on the one hand and diversity on the other hand, I think that we have to ask ourselves, as a country, are we setting up a system where each person, particularly each child, has an equal opportunity to succeed? And I want to be autobiographical, but my younger sister and I came along at a time, we talked about being brown babies at the beginning of this call. And my younger sister and I were bused across town to better schools because our parents lived in the inner city, and the schools in the neighborhood were actually suboptimal schools. Our lives were very different because of a race-conscious decision on the part of the people who ran the school district to provide some small number of African-American kids with an extraordinary opportunity to get a better education than they could because of the real estate that their parents could afford. When you think about it, those kids who came out of that neighborhood who didn't get that opportunity, it wasn't because they had less merit than me. That's manifestly incorrect. They just had a different set of opportunities. And I think we have to make sure that we think about those structural barriers, for example, that children have, right? They get it. We know from data. It happens from preschool. If kids are not given the right opportunity to be provided an education, an equal education, then later on, people are going to say, well, that child who's had these structural disadvantages all his or her life, they lack the same merit that someone else has. And then I will say this because I know there's a lot of lawyers on the phone. There's also the question beyond sort of societal opportunity. There's the issue of what opportunity exists in the corporation or in the law firm. We all know that experience is the stock and trade of lawyers. And as lawyers come into these law firms, we have to be very careful that as we hand out, for example, work assignments to young lawyers, that we're being even-handed with those opportunities for people to demonstrate what their real ability is. I think that's a very important issue because if we don't, then we're going to find we continue this pattern that we have, for example, in law firms, where today we have scarcely more partners of color in those law firms than we did when Ken and I graduated law school in the late 1970s.
I'm on the edge of my seat, as I know many who are listening are, to your sage advice and your wisdom on these various subjects. And to your point about not much has changed, still less than 1% of equity partners are Black women. So, we've got a lot of work to do, and I'm so happy that the two of you are part of those who are really leading the way. But now I have to pivot to another subject, if you don't mind, and that is democracy. And so President Smith has been very focused on promoting democracy during her term as president, and you both served as advisors to her Americans for Democracy Task Force. So what do you believe, and we're going to talk about this just briefly because we've got a few more things to talk about before we wrap up. So just briefly, could you just share what you believe are the most pressing challenges to democracy, and what is your advice as to what we can do? And during this Black History Month, what should we be thinking about in terms of preserving our democracy in this United States?
And let me just commend the ABA and Mary Smith for forming this task force, because I think we're at a very critical time in our country. One of the things that I know, Ken and I know Paulette, I know you believe this, is the idea of America is incredibly compelling. And despite the fact that we have fallen short in many cases, the relative progress that we have made against any nation in the world is astounding. And let me be very clear, I am the first one to talk about the shortfalls, but I also think it's important to understand the ideals and the progress we have made. Our democracy is precious. Every citizen has a role. But when the rule of law is under threat, which I think it is, that's very concerning. When we're in an environment where facts don't matter, that's a problem. When we, in fact, don't adhere to some of the basic rights that citizens should have, that's a problem. And I think that one of the things that I hope the task force will be able to do is to encourage all citizens of this country to understand not only what their rights are, but also what their responsibilities are as citizens. And I think we are at a time where the threats to our democracy are very substantial. And America has faced some of these threats in the past, but I think with technology, with social media, with artificial intelligence, it is more important than ever that we understand what it means to live in a democracy and what our responsibilities are to preserve a democracy.
Well, there's very little that I can add to what Ken just said because it was so eloquent, but I will make a couple of points. First of all, on the democracy side of things, the right to vote is a sacred right. It is the core of our democracy, and we have to be very careful about any efforts to make it harder for people to cast legitimate votes, eligible voters to vote. I think that's a very important issue. I think the next issue, and Ken touched on it, is the respect for the rule of law. And I think when we are seeing some of the comments that are being made about our judicial system, about our legal system, I think we as lawyers need to take a stand to defend the system. And that means also in our own local communities, where people look to us as people with legal training to help them understand some of these complicated issues. Right now, if you turn the TV on, almost every night, we're talking about the legal system. Is it fair? Is it political? You know, I think most people, if you'd gone back in time, you had a time traveling machine and you went back 50 years, I think people would say the kinds of things that we routinely hear on our television sets and on social media, the critiques of our legal system, sound like the things that people used to say about, for example, banana republics in Latin America when I was a kid. I think we have to be very careful to preserve the respect for the rule of law, which is also the respect for the independence of the judiciary.
And Kinsey, you touched on AI a bit when you spoke of democracy. And I want to just go to that for a few moments and to get your thoughts on AI, because it is like every other word that we hear these days. AI and how it's not only influencing the population or the world at large, but in specific, the legal profession. And what can be done to sort of control AI and make it have a positive effect on the legal profession, on how, you know, in this Black History Month, how people who are disadvantaged can use AI to their benefit, et cetera?
I'm a believer that we need to embrace technology, and we need to embrace AI, because I think it can be an incredible enabler. I mean, as Ken and I know, I think the potential of AI in healthcare is unbelievable. I think the potential of AI in education is unbelievable, in workforce training and development. So I think there are many opportunities. But the reality is, and this goes back to a fundamental belief that I know Ken and I share, is we believe that companies exist because society allows us to exist. And we have a responsibility. And so, with respect to AI, I think that we should not just rely, because things are moving so quickly, literally in AI, it's every 2 or 3 weeks. Something is happening that we can't expect the government alone to be able to regulate all that happens. So the question is, for companies, what is the governance? What are the protocols? What are the guidelines that are going to be put in? And we have a philosophy at General Catalyst that we talk about the importance of responsible innovation, which is really critical because, let's be very clear, we need to continue to innovate. You innovate or you die. But the important point is how to do it in a responsible way. And so we're very focused on helping set up guidelines because, frankly, we don't want to repeat what has happened with social media, that people did not understand not only the intended consequences, but the unintended consequences. And so I think what's critical is that companies in particular need to focus on guidelines, on governance. They need to think about what are the harmful impacts that need to be dealt with. And this requires a very different mindset. So the era of move fast and break things, we can't do that with AI. We can move fast, but we need to do it responsibly.
Can I just go to a question? We have a question from the audience, and that question is from Nikki Monroe, who is the chair of the business law section. Nikki?
The Barbie movie has garnered over $1.4 billion worldwide, becoming the top grossing Warner Brothers film of all time. The movie calls attention to feminism and patriarchy, and in the end, emphasizes individual growth, role sharing, and equality. Keeping with the movie themes, and because we have our former CEO Ken's joining us, this Barbie wants to know, how important are leadership roles for women in corporations? How have you helped women get seats at the table and grow in those leadership roles? And finally, what do you think is still left to do for women to achieve equality?
I have not seen the Barbie movie yet. I will see
Or
it
have I?
at some point. But I think what's critical, and this goes back to the point on excellence and diversity, is when people say, boy, diversity causes problems, the reality is we were denying 50% of the population for receiving business opportunities. And I believe that what needs to happen, and has happened in a number of areas, is here's a surprising thing that happens. When you have a woman in a leadership position, or you have a Black in a leadership position, chances are, over a several year period, you will see more women, you will see more Blacks. Now, one of the things I've said to men is you do have to be an ally. But to be an ally, you need to be a strong sponsor and mentor. Because in the room, I would always say to our people, is this the type of person that you're going to pound the table for? Because that's what you need. Women need these sponsors. Blacks need these sponsors. Latinos need these sponsors. LGBTQ need these sponsors. People saying they deserve an opportunity. That's what has to happen.
Thank you. So, Ken Frazier, I want to talk to you about your legal training. And even though you were the general counsel and then you moved to the business side to become CEO. So, you know, some will say you once were a lawyer and you transitioned into a more traditional business role. How did that law degree prepare you for your role as a CEO?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say, first of all, that my law degree and my subsequent practice was one that helped me to ask the right questions, and it allowed me to understand how different people saw issues and raised different issues. But for me, I think the most important thing in making this transition, and it goes to something that Ken just spoke to about sponsorship and allyship, is when I joined Merck, I joined as a lawyer. Shortly after I joined, the CEO, a great CEO named Roy Vagelos, called me into his office. And he said, look, we hired you with the expectation that when our current general counsel retires in about 5 or 6 years, you'll be the next general counsel. But I don't want you to spend the next 5 or 6 years sharpening your legal skills because we think you already have the legal skills. We're going to throw you in the deep end of the pool. We're going to put you in the middle of the business, and we're going to allow you to learn the business. And my initial response was, well, Dr. Vagelos, I'd like to contribute to Merck in my own discipline, meaning the law, to which he responded, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. We're giving you a chance to broaden your skills. And so I think the most important thing that ever happened to me was that I had mentors and sponsors who saw in me the opportunity to do things beyond anything that I actually thought that I could be able to do. So I think that was the biggest issue, moving out of the law department early on. In fact, I was at the company 31 years. I counted up. Only 7 of the 31 were in the legal department. The other 24 were in the business in some way. So that was a big thing that helped me a lot.
Roy Vagelos was one of the most respected CEOs of his era. But a question that I've asked CEOs is how many of you would have done what Roy Vagelos did? And to Ken's earlier point, there are more Ken Fraziers, there are more Ken Chenaults out there. But what they need is, just as women need it, they need someone to say, I believe you can do this, and I'm going to put you in a role, and I'm going to open up your aperture of what you can in fact do. And that those people are incredible, but we need more Roy Vageloses who will say, I'm gonna give you the opportunity. And let's be clear, he's not giving Ken a break. All he was saying is, I'm going to give you the opportunity, and I'm going to be very demanding, but he gave him the opportunity.
And we have a question from Tommy Preston, who is the former chair of the Young Lawyers Division of the American Bar Association. Tommy?
Hey, first, I want to take a moment to thank both of you for paving the way for people like me to serve in senior leadership positions in corporate America. There's no question that we stand on your shoulders. My question is, what advice would you have for lawyers who are interested in in-house positions or even serving as general counsel or CEO? And connected to that question, what specific tips do you have for Black professionals who are interested in climbing the C-suite ladder in an environment that's still fairly underrepresented?
You know, often there isn't a real straight path between one thing and another. I think it's important in one's career, in one's life, to embrace opportunity when it comes along. I never thought that I would go from being a jury trial lawyer to being a CEO. That is not at all the kind of path that most people would take. But I was very fortunate that when the opportunity to join Merck came up, which I wasn't looking for, I was very fortunate that my spouse, my wife, Andrea, said, I think you need to take this opportunity and not be afraid to move out of your comfort zone. So my advice to people is embrace opportunity, broaden your skills, show your curiosity, and to not worry about going into an area where your skills are not necessarily directly applicable to the work.
I would follow up on Ken's excellent comments. I think what was important, as Ken said, is he had the intellectual curiosity, and at the end of the day, he had the courage to move out of his comfort zone. And one of the things I really believe strongly, if you want to move into the C-suite, or, for example, for my general counsel, I obviously wanted someone who was an excellent lawyer, but fundamentally, I wanted someone who was curious enough to really learn the businesses so they could be a partner to me and obviously deal with the legal issues. But what I didn't want was someone who was a great lawyer, but was detached from the business. And then as far as moving up the corporate ladder, and this is a tough one, particularly for minorities, moving up the ladder, is, I will say, sometimes we're overcautious. We're so careful. And at the end of the day, one of the things I believe in, we're very visible. And so the reality is that you need to make a difference, and you need to have the willingness to take some risks and then say, if I fail, or this company does not recognize what I've done, I'm going to leave. Frankly, sometimes I think we stay in organizations too long. And yes, it's difficult, particularly for us, to find that next opportunity. But part of what we got to do is we got to keep our eye on the prize. We've got to understand when we should take risks, and it should be informed risk, shouldn't be reckless. But you're not going to make it to the top being careful at every step of the way.
I think one of the big challenges for African Americans is that often they have great talent that's hidden in plain sight. And what happened to me was that I had someone who was committed to giving me an equal chance to exhibit what all my abilities were. I didn't earn that opportunity. He gave me that opportunity, but he understood that I was a presumptive outsider. So he used a lot of his insider status, including his own credibility in his organization, to give an outsider this opportunity. And so I would just ask people, with respect to women and other minorities, how much of your own personal capital are you willing to devote to helping people have that opportunity?
Thank you. And so we're short on time, but I don't want to leave out law students and young lawyers who you've already given so much information, so much inspiration, and so much hope. And so I want, for the lawyers, young lawyers and students tuned in today, what are the immediate opportunities that you see for them? And what particular advice would you give to them about maybe your younger self? If we could briefly say that, and I see the young lawyer waving her hand to ask a question, who is currently the current chair of the YLD, and I want to get to her question before we leave. But if you can briefly just tell us, what advice would you give to young lawyers and to law students?
Look, I would say, from my perspective, and I only was a practicing lawyer for 2.5 years, is to be open to opportunity. Obviously, you want to learn your craft. You want to be thorough in the assignments that you're given. But at the same time, I really believe that legal training prepares you for so many things. And what's important is to demonstrate both a level of competence, but also a level of intellectual curiosity, and to be open and to pursue some opportunities. And for me, when I found out about consulting from talking to some people, I wrote letters to 4 or 5 of the top consulting firms, blind. Everybody rejected me except one, Bain and Company. And it was fortuitous that they were experimenting. They had tried a lawyer who had been able to make the transition to consulting, and they said, let's try 1 or 2 more. So I think at the end of the day, don't be defined just by your existing job.
You have to believe in yourself. The outside world, particularly given some of the outside discussions about race, for example, right now, people can lose their own self-confidence. And it's important for you to recognize that you have a certain amount of ability. You want to build on that ability, as Ken said, take advantage of your opportunities, but always, always believe in yourself.
We have one last question, and that is from Tamara Nash, who is the current chair of the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. Tamara?
Young and new lawyers have a passion to advance social change. At the same time, we can experience or perceive barriers to activism because we are not yet in positions of power or authority. How can young and new lawyers use their voice, get involved, and make a positive impact without negatively impacting our career potential so early in its trajectory? Thank you.
When I graduated law school like Ken, I saw myself as a civil rights lawyer. But I ended up in a very large law firm in Philadelphia. And what I realized very quickly was that my opportunity to make a contribution in my community wasn't by being a social activist. It was by becoming a better lawyer. And I used the pro bono opportunities that were available to do what you're calling activism, but in the ways that only lawyers can do it. When you're representing people who are under sentence of death and are, 2 weeks away from their execution, all the social activism in the world will not spare that person. Good lawyering will. And I had the opportunity as a young lawyer to work for a guy named Bill Coleman, who was one of the authors of the Brown Brief. And Bill made this point to me that what our community needs are excellent lawyers. He talked about how when he and Thurgood and others were litigating the cases that led up to Brown, how there was a premium on excellence. He said, Thurgood Marshall, when he was running the Legal Defense Fund, had no time for a sloppy lawyer. And he said to me, you've got to decide whether you want to be a good lawyer or an excellent lawyer. And then I found that with my lawyer suit on, I could make contributions that were unique to my ability as a lawyer. And so I would just say, grow yourself as a lawyer, grow yourself as a business person, get to those top positions, get to those corridors of power. Because to go back to something that Derek Bell said, which Ken alluded to at the beginning, he said, we need Thurgood Marshalls in the boardroom, not just in the courtroom.
Ken, you should tell your death row case, because I think that is an incredible example that you carried through that I think is very important for people to hear.
So very quickly, I had a case where I had a client in Alabama who was 2 weeks shy of his execution date. He did not commit the crime that he was on death row for. He spent 19 years on the row. We got the case. We were able to exonerate him. But one of the things that I asked Merck for, and actually it was a demand, when I left private practice, I said, I'm going to keep this case. I'm going to try this case without in-house. I wasn't even in the legal department. I was in the business, but I tried that case because I was committed to it. And I think it really opened Merck's eyes in a way because they said, oh, this is really important to him. So I asked to be allowed to discharge my professional responsibilities. And I think we all have those opportunities as professionals to show what our values are as lawyers and as professionals.
I think you keep your passion. It absolutely, whatever you do, you want to be excellent at it. But, what I found was being involved in some local community organizations, sometimes sanctioned by the law firm or the company I was at, sometimes not, was fulfilling to me. And I think that you can be an excellent lawyer, an excellent business person, and still be involved in your community. Now, the question is, do you need to be the leader of the organization? I would say starting off, in most cases, no, because you're learning your craft. But you can still be involved. You should be involved, because here's what's very important is increasingly people are going to judge you based on the convictions that you have. And people who have convictions, I think, generally turn out to be people that organizations will believe that they have to take seriously. And that's what you want at the end of the day, is you want to be taken seriously. And if you're serious about being involved in social causes, you can do that, but you also need to be very serious about learning your craft.
And with those wonderful parting words, I'd like to extend my warmest gratitude to Ken Frazier and to Ken Chenault for providing us with such excellent advice and such wonderful words of wisdom, things that will carry us way beyond Black History Month. So thank you for all that you do and continue to do, and for being with us, and for this wonderful insights. And two things that I am left with is that diversity is not mutually exclusive to excellence, and that you have to follow your passion and be excellent in all that you do. So thank you very much, because you demonstrate, you are the epitome of excellence, and we appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for your time. And I am going to turn it over to President Mary Smith to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paulette, for that great conversation. And thank you so much, Ken Frazier and Ken Chenault. Stay tuned for our next ABA Presidential Speaker Series honoring Women's History Month with Rosie Rios, Chair of America 250, which is celebrating the 250th anniversary of our country. The program will be moderated by Frederique Irwin, CEO of the National Women's History Museum. And consider joining the American Bar Association at ambar.org/membership. Thanks so much for joining us.